Episode 1 of Behind Your Eyes begins with Louise getting dressed ready for her big night out. Or, as Louise calls it, drinks with a mate. Well, that mate happens to be Sophie, who unfortunately bails on her, leaving Louise all alone in a raucous bar with a glass of wine. On the way out though, she accidentally spills a drink on a suave man's shirt. She buys him another drink, charged an eye-watering £12, wow, welcome to London, and eventually sits with him. The two immediately hit it off, sharing more than one drink as they both set boundaries. Louise won't go home with him, but he does kiss her goodbye. Only, he suddenly gets cold feet and leaves, telling Louise he can't do this. Well, we soon find out why. Louise shows up at work where David happens to be in an office. It turns out he's the man from the bar, and he's there with his wife, Adele. After heading home and mulling it over, Louise takes a turn for the worst when she suddenly experiences a strange night terror. Her son Adam is there, inside a dilapidated house with an eerie green hue clinging to the walls. Louise awakens with a start though, as this strange presence remains a mystery for now. Meanwhile, David prepares for his first day at work, saying goodbye to Adele. It's clear the pair have problems though, which are exemplified when Adele opens up her cupboards to reveal a whole stack of pills. Is he keeping her indoctrinated? Well, David promises to call at 11:30 a.m. as Adele calls after him cheerily, "I'll be here." While David attends a meeting, Louise drops off Adam at school and heads into work. She immediately ruins her white top by spilling ketchup all down herself. She tries wiping it off, but it's no good, eventually finding herself face to face with a very shocked David. She promises to keep things discreet and not mention it to anyone, especially given she's now working as his secretary. He eventually apologizes as Louise jokes that he could do with a psychiatrist. Well, the two eventually start working together as Louise points out a number of different hotspots in the community. Apparently his specialty is dealing with addicts, and as the two casually flirt and dance around what happened between them, we see a vastly contrasting conversation ensue. Around a table full of psychologists, Adele and David discuss their marriage and in particular, David's big opportunity in this town. Adele puts him on the spot and back home, begins kissing him intimately. She promises that this will be the last time as David exasperates, telling her he's not able to do this again. Quite what that something is remains a mystery, but for now the two make love. Only, it's clearly mired in tension. During a flashback, we see glimmers of Adele's past. Rob and Adele are patients at a rehab center as Adele is called the girl who paints fires. Rob is dubbed the boy who sleepwalks. It's a hiccup in what's otherwise an episode rooted in the present, with David eventually deciding to hand over Adele's phone. He's going to be doing outreach work for addicts, and that means he'll be away from her longer than he normally is. She calls him a good man and reassures her lover, telling David it won't be a problem. Louise struggles to shake the images of David, as the two are nervous around one another at work. We continue to see glimmers of Louise's past too, with a bottle of pills spilling on the floor, and that familiar eerie house. A piercing scream from Adam and piercing screams from Adam sees Louise awaken suddenly, out on the balcony after sleepwalking. She collapses over and begins sobbing, sporting a cut wrist for her troubles. In the morning, Ian drops off Adam to Louise with a big proposal. His new partner, Lisa, is expecting their child, and they have an offer on a house in the south of France. Ian wants to take Adam with him, for the month anyway, to allow him time to bond with Lisa. Louise is completely against the idea though, believing herself to be the practice wife for Ian's new family. Even worse, Ian has already got Adam excited about this. Thanks to Sophie's kind words, Louise eventually comes round to the idea, allowing her to take this time to recharge and find herself, which may just be what she needs to change her life. Lost in her thoughts after dropping Adam off at school, Louise bumps into Adele in the street. They properly introduce themselves as Adele invites her out for a coffee, the perfect remedy for knocking her down. "You lead, I'll follow," she says as they walk. Episode 2 of Behind Your Eyes begins with Louise and Adele out for their scheduled coffee. A week has passed since David started working, as Adele probes Louise for information. It's been 3 years since Louise's divorce as Adele asks outright whether there's a new man in her life at all. Louise chuckles nervously, telling her there isn't as Adele notices the cut on her wrist. When Louise mentions sleepwalking, Adele immediately piques her interest as memories of Rob come flashing back for her. Partway through their conversation, the pair are interrupted by David, who rings to check up on her. Adele lies, telling him she's alone as it seems like he's keeping her on a tight leash. When she hangs up, Adele takes Louise's number so they can catch up again. Louise says her goodbyes, but she can hardly make it across the street before Adele messages and enthusiastically gives her number. On the back of her meeting, Adele heads home and starts painting. After stopping for a tea break, she tellingly drops one of the pills she's been taking down the sink. This single action casts us back to the past again, with Adele and Rob up in the tree talking. Marjorie arrives and tells Adele that she has a call. As she heads inside, David happens to be on the phone checking up on her, just like before. Rob listens from the wings before eventually joining in on the conversation. She wants David to meet Rob, reassuring her lover that he's not a threat to him. Back in the present, David tellingly rings the home phone to check up on Adele. It's a move that she immediately calls him out for, but he brushes it aside, telling Adele he's going to be late as he has some community work in the local area. This prompts Adele to start painting, furiously sweeping large lines of blues and greens that eventually merge into a hauntingly beautiful picture of a forest. As we cut between this painting and the forest, the camera centers on a well and a pocket watch sitting on the floor. This watch belongs to David, a gift from Adele that he encouraged her to wear the entire time she was in this facility. Before she can dwell on this further, David heads home and sees the painting for himself. He asks her exactly why she's done this, staring wide-eyed at this painting. The next day, Louise receives a text from Adele, asking to meet. She even suggests getting her a day pass so they can head to the gym together. Louise ignores the text though, instead heading back to work. The cheery and lively David we've seen before disappears, replaced by a grumpy, bad-tempered man who's none too happy to see Louise. He snaps at her when she tries to talk to him, prompting Louise to message Adele back and head out with her after all. How much of this is just to spite David, however, remains to be seen. Back at the clinic, a man named Anthony arrives to see David. He's a new patient, one that's booked in for a repeat session, after David successfully manages to knock down his hostile walls. The next day, Adele and Louise both head out to the gym, but Louise is clearly struggling to keep up with her opposite number. This seems to be a metaphor for their relationship really, as Adele and Louise sit in the sauna together and discuss the former's past. It's cryptic, but Adele mentions how her parents were victims of a fire. Apparently they didn't stand a chance. It's a fragment of the past, not enough to actually know what really took place, but could tie in with Rob's nickname in the past, calling her the girl who paints fire. Now it's Louise's turn to be out of her comfort zone, as she heads over to Adele's place and marvels at the luxurious sights. Adele hands over a book to help with her night terrors. Although rare, it's not unheard of to remember nightmares. As we soon find out, Adele actually experienced these herself too, suggesting they open up the possibility of lucid dreaming to allow her to control her dreams. Back home, Louise helps Adam pack up his things ready to leave. After hurriedly smoking a cigarette out on the balcony, she heads in and painfully smiles, hugging goodbye to her. With the house to herself, Louise uses Rob's dream journal to take the first steps in controlling her visions. Along with that though, we get to see Rob's innermost thoughts, including how he and Adele were friends, and he'd do anything for her. Suddenly, she's snapped out of her entranced thoughts by David, who appears at the door. This is, of course, slightly awkward given he told David she wasn't feeling well earlier in the day. Well, Louise invites him in nonetheless, and the two sit and share a glass of wine. He admits he didn't want to head home as he's been thinking about her a lot. Given the difficult position Louise finds herself in, she tells him to head home, but temptation eventually gets the better of them, and the two wind up making love. Afterwards though, Louise regrets their actions and promises not to take this to work with them. David eventually trundles home as Adele senses something amiss. Her haunting look in bed is telling a woman's intuition, perhaps. Whatever it is, the camera pans up to show those familiar woods again. What happened there that's rattled our characters so? We shall see. Episode 3 of Behind Your Eyes begins with Adele repeating Rob's mantra about controlling her dreams. Staying calm and focused, as well as thinking of a door, her dream of the woods, suddenly sees her awaken with David looking down on her. Night turns to day, and both David and Louise do their best to put the events of the previous evening out of their minds. This inevitably leads to a whole series of awkward encounters at work. That's exacerbated by Adele ringing David and wanting to know where he was the previous night. He can't answer, nor can he say I love you too until he's prompted by Adele herself. After what happened, Rob heads over to Louse's house and tells her he wants to be her friend. Despite regretting what they did, he can't shake the feeling that there's a connection between the two. David tells Louise that she's shining, while Adele has lost her spark. This time though, Louise tells him to leave. During another flashback, Rob and Adele smoke together while discussing their secrets. Specifically, how Adele wants a relationship with David where they're completely open and don't leave any secrets. As we know from the present, this definitely hasn't come to fruition. Adele cooks dinner for David, but when he returns home, mentions how he's not hungry. As they talk, David asks whether it's happening again, but she dances around his question and tells him he's scary when he shouts. At work the next day, tensions continue to simmer as Adele rings David at work and tells her what she plans to do. Louise happens to be listening though, and deliberates over what Adele has told David. Eventually Louise agrees to head out with Adele. Louise finds herself drowning in guilt though as Adele mentions how David is staying in the spare room and may well be drinking again. The attention soon turns to Louise's dreams though, as she promises to keep trying to break through her subconscious mind. At work that night, things take a tense turn when Anthony shows up at David's office demanding to talk. David is calm, managing to unwind Anthony's temper and book him in for an hour session the next day. With things settled down, David and Louise hook up again. And again. And again, as we skip forward through time. After hooking up on the sofa, David finally opens up and talks about his past. Near where his parents' house was, he pulled a girl out from the fire and claims that he doesn't know what happened to her afterwards. As many may have pieced together by now, this girl is actually Adele. This gets Louise thinking, who falls asleep and experiences another night terror, this one involving David and Adele both burning. These dreams continue as Louise falls asleep thinking of a door. Rob's mantra echoes through her mind as she walks around the strange, distorted house in her subconscious mind. Suddenly realizing she's dreaming, Louise spots a yellow door and walks through. This leads back into her apartment where she takes in the sights and sounds, seemingly at peace. Meanwhile, David returns home to find Adele sitting in the dark, sporting a black eye. Adele head out on her own and broke David's instructions. What will the ramifications be for this? Episode 4 of Behind Your Eyes begins with Louise in Dreamland, talking to Adam, while David is off barbecuing in a garden that looks eerily similar to the one in Teletubbies. Anyway, there's no baby-faced son here, just Louise living in euphoric bliss. Outside the dream world, David hands over a red and yellow pill for Adele to take. He checks her mouth, including under her tongue, to make sure she's taken it. It's clear things are tense, but they take a turn for the unexpected when Anthony shows up at the house. With Adele sporting a black eye, she feigns fear and makes it seem like David actually hit her. In fact, she echoes the same unconvincing covered story to Louise later on while acting nervously around her. The pair head out running, where they eventually collapse together on a hill in the park. There, they catch their breath and discuss Rob's notebook. It's a brief talk in truth, but one that sees Louise admit that the book could change her life. Anyway, there's no time for that when Louise returns to work and learns that the incident with Anthony has caused big issues. In fact, David is going to be investigated on the back of Adele's black eye. Mr. Sharma rings Adele immediately and checks if David has hit her or not. She chuckles and divulges the same covered story as Louise silently listens from the other room on the phone. David does himself no favors when he comes over to visit Louise. After unceremoniously gulping down a glass of wine, she too asks outright whether he hit Adele. David despairs, telling her he hasn't but also that he doesn't buy into Adele's covered story either. These doubts continue as Louise reads Rob's diary that night, centering on an entry about Rob's doubts and suspicions involving David driving by at the exact moment Adele was in a fire. Is this really a coincidence? Or is there more going on here? Anyway, we skip across to another dream segment, this time from Adele's perspective. A shimmer appears in David's office as Adele seems to inexplicably project herself out and sees them both together. David spills his true feelings, mentioning how he's fully in love with Louise. Well, this causes Adele to suddenly bolt upright in bed and begin sobbing. With Adele's eye all healed up, she heads out and visits Anthony. The two talk together while sharing secrets, but not before he hands over some drugs for her. After all this time being clean, it's obvious now that David's anchor has well and truly gone. In the past, we see more flashbacks involving Rob. He heads over to visit Adele outside the rehab facility, marveling at her new surroundings. As he asks how she finds it, Adele sadly utters lonely as her response. Back in the present, Adele's closeness to Louise is finally uncovered as Emma from the gym phones to confirm a guest membership with Louise. While Adele is cooking, a shocked and surprised David checks Adele's phone and sees all the messages to Louise. He's unable to control himself, and he immediately storms off to Louise's apartment. David struggles to compose himself as he confronts Louise about her friendship with Adele. David calls her crazy, as Louise admits that she felt sorry for the girl and knew she was lonely, so tried to be there for her. As they talk, Louise believes that Adele is the victim here. She mentions the money and how controlling David is, leading him to fire her on the spot and tell the girl to pack her things up and leave. Louise is understandably shocked and the next day at work breaks the news to Dr. Sharma and pretends she's leaving on a family matter. Louise heads over to check up on Adele and make sure she's okay. Realizing that she may be in danger, Louise breaks into Adele's house and notices her passed out on the chair. Louise moves her into the bedroom and eventually manages to nurse Adele back to health. It's here Adele mentions the pills she's been taking and how David had an affair with another woman during their time in Brighton. This house was supposed to be their fresh start, but old habits die hard, especially given David's affair with Louise at the moment. David eventually returns that evening and asks outright whether Adele knew who Louise was before befriending her. She tells him she didn't, telling David he needs to move on. David, however, is not sure what to believe anymore. As glimmers of the past sparkle through again, we see more of that pocket watch in the well. As the camera zooms out, a bloodied Rob lies motionless, his body contorted awkwardly. Was he pushed? Or is he still alive and this is some weird Bly Manor crossover? We'll have to wait. Episode 5 of Behind Your Eyes begins with an ironic rendition of Mr. Sandman as our character continue to tackle their bizarre dreams. During this montage, Adele slips further into the addictive grip of heroin, sloppily painting her nails. David, meanwhile, struggles to concentrate at work. Back home, Louise greets Adam, who has returned from his trip to France. Ian thanks her for being mature about the whole thing, as the two finally start talking properly. Louise tells him she's happy for him, as that initial hostility they felt earlier in the season disappears. Sophie heads over to see Louise, where the truth about her job is unveiled. Sophie tries to lecture Louise, but our protagonist hits back, telling her she doesn't need to hear it right now. Despite being out the affair, Louise can't shake the feeling of worrying about Adele. Having heard enough, Sophie decides to leave. That evening, Louise organizes a babysitter for Adam, while heading back to the office after hours. There, she siphons through David's documents and finds numerous strange notes and scattered thoughts within Adele's file. This is 10 years worth of material, something that certainly raises some concerns for Louise as she flits through what's there. Adele looks at Louise with admiration when she sees this, commenting how she's acting just like Rob used to. Apparently everything here stemmed from Rob originally, as Adele leads Louise upstairs to show her the painting of the well up on the wall. Adele solemnly declares that she thinks David killed Rob there. That evening, Louise begins reading more journal entries from Rob, with the attention turning to his time back on the estate after rehab. Rob was immediately drawn back to drugs, exhibiting nervousness as he decides to pack his things up and head off to see Adele at her country estate. "Fuck off old life, hello new," he hopefully proclaims, while sitting on a train. As Louise reads the words, she's back inside the Teletubbies-esque world again. Only this time a door materializes in the middle of this area, leading through to the same dreamy, ethereal state that Adele experienced last episode. Suddenly bursting upright, Louise breathes heavily before deciding to do some research online. That research leads her to a Glaswegian number for Rob's family, but she's interrupted by David arriving at her door. He wants the keys and file she took, promoting Louise to head out and hand back the keys. David promises things will get ugly if she continues, especially given the security footage he's obtained of her lurking outside. Louise admits that Adele has the file, but she doesn't know what to believe anymore. Back home, David confronts Adele about how she knew who Louise was all this time. As she sits down to eat, David struggles to control himself. In fact, he outright asks her for a divorce. Adele remains stern, telling him not to ask for things he doesn't mean, before spitting her food out as David heads upstairs. In the past, Rob and Adele both work on their astral projections, somehow projecting their consciousnesses out of their body and swirling down in a neon-lit wisp through the mansion to the well outside. In the morning, Rob reads more about this online, mentioning outright that she doesn't want to know how or why, and was actually doing her astral projections the night of the fire. She mentions how it's like a muscle, managing to project this far away from her own body. This seems to explain, I use that term lightly, why she was able to project all the way to David's office. It still, however, doesn't explain why their orbs were neon lit, and everything else isn't. Anyway, we continue. Back in the present, Louise phones Ilse Hoyle and begins asking questions about her brother, Rob. It turns out she hasn't heard from Rob in over 10 years, and there's certainly no love lost here. Ilse calls him a shite, and how he's not worth her time. After this conversation, Louise begins to suspect that Adele was telling the truth this whole time, and that David really did kill Rob. Speaking of astral projections, Louise once again channels her projection and swirls right in front of her neighbor's face. The orb suddenly swirls back in and straight to Louise as a sobbing and frightened Adam kneels over her. It's here Louise realizes that what she's experiencing is exactly the same as Adele. Thinking back over everything they've done together, she realizes that bumping into Adele wasn't a chance encounter. Episode 6 of Behind Your Eyes begins with Louise deliberating over what Adele has told her. Given this all started in Brighton, Louise heads down to the south coast in a bid to learn more about the past. In fact, she finds Mary Ann working in a coffee shop, and after sobbing, Mary Ann agrees to help her. It's here Mary Ann spills the truth about her involvement with David. Apparently it started out innocently enough with talking, wisps of David's oozing charm was too much. One day, Adele showed up at her door and told Mary Ann that David belongs to her. That evening things went from bad to worse when Mary Ann showed up home to find her knife drawer open and her apartment trashed. Scrawled on the wall, in what seems like blood, is the word slut. Adele appears at the front door with a knife in hand, confirming that she was the one to do this. Adele threatened her, handing over the knife and scaring Mary Ann. She phoned David, but it's clear he wasn't shocked, despite being as scared as she was. Flashbacks unveil more of this troubled time at the estate. David, Rob and Adele shared time together, with Rob struggling to hide his jealousy in the wake of Rob and Adele cozying up together. In fact, he plays third wheel as he watches them kissing and getting intimate at the dinner table. When Adele eventually retires to bed, David and Rob discuss their love interest, where Rob admits that he's jealous of the pair. That evening, Rob uses his astral projections to watch both David and Adele make love in their room. Back in the present, Louise phones through to the clinic and adopts Mary Ann's identity. A frazzled David shows up in the middle of a busy London street to find Louise, not Mary Ann, there. Louise calls Adele insane and admits that she knows something is amiss with her. And just like that, David admits that Rob is dead. Apparently he died from an overdose. Adele panicked and threw him down the well along with Rob's watch, which fell in along with him. David remained worried, but Adele convinced him to live with the guilt. In fact, Adele moved on like it was nothing, and threatened to go to the police and blame it on him if he didn't cooperate. David decides to head up to Scotland and break this cycle once and for all. He reassures Louise that everything is going to be okay and hops on a train. While he does, Louise drops off Adam at Ian's place and heads home, determined to confront Adele's astral projection. As Louise screams to the heavens, Adele suddenly rings. She calls Adele out for the affair and explains how this astral projection works. Louise refuses to buy into this though, as Adele claims she did all this to try and draw her away from David and hate him. Louise breaks the news that David has gone to the police over the well incident. The only way to break this cycle is to tell the truth, which Adele refuses to do and instead curses down the phone. After thinking back over the past, Adele writes a note incriminating herself and decides to throw all her pills away. She decides against holding David prisoner, choosing the cowardly way out rather than being alone. As Louise receives the messages through about Adele, she realizes what this means and races up to the house, just as Adele lights rags placed in the electrics. Louise hurries over to help, but her phone fails to connect. Instead, Louise decides to astral project her way inside, using that familiar doorway from before and making it upstairs to the bedroom. There, she finds Adele asleep on the bed and her projection lying in wait in the air. It races outside and somehow switches places with Louise's consciousness. They both body swap somehow as Adele shoots up Louise's arm with more smack. Louise whispers Adam's name before Adele drags her out the house and waits for the police to show up. Adele, inside Louise's body of course, heads back home. She memorizes all the key details of Louise's life and heads out to pick up Adam from Ian's place. Her son immediately senses something is up, but goes with her nonetheless. Adele meets David, believing that everything is over, and kisses him. As we skip back in time again, we see Rob and Adele practicing changing bodies. In fact, it turns out Rob was actually Adele this entire time and took her body for himself. He killed Adele in his body before throwing down the well. Rob, who's not actually Adele and is now inside Louise's body, eventually gets married to David, but Adam senses something up with the episode review. Well, where do you start with that? I think Adele's manic cursing down the phone pretty accurately sums up the way this final episode has gone. In a way, Behind Your Eyes is quite reminiscent of Game of Thrones Season 8. Much like the fantasy epic, this series started brightly with some tightly written segments and nice ideas before eventually falling into ridiculous sloppiness. This whole astral projection malarkey has been drawn out to such a degree that it actually undermines a lot of the good work done early on. It's another good example of how a plot twister idea can completely destroy the narrative focus on compelling character arcs, and for many people, this will betray the 5 hours we've spent with these characters in this dark, twisted and unsatisfying ending. Adele was never Adele this whole time, and was actually Rob who wanted to keep David with him. He murdered Adele and then did the same thing to Louise in order to jump bodies. Only, this renders Louise's entire character arc useless. Lousy starts out as a bright, likable protagonist before having her entire arc butchered. We never really saw much of her past, including the pill bottle and a parent-ed relative, nor do we really understand why she can astral project. And what's with that creepy house? Is the show implying that everyone who experiences night terrors can astral project? Is there a formula to it? How did Rob uncover this trick? And what is Rob's end goal here? Is he going to live forever by switching bodies with as many people as possible? Does David not realize Adele isn't really Adele anymore? None of it really makes much sense, despite there being foreshadowed warnings early on that things were amiss. Credit where credit's due, the show does do a good job of foreshadowing this, but beyond that, the twist ending isn't a very good one. What started as a really promising miniseries has somehow managed to worm its way into one of the worst TV shows of 2021. For many people, I'd imagine this ending will be up there with Game of Thrones and Dexter as one of the worst ever. Of course, there will be some that enjoy the twist, but for this reviewer, the lack of explanation, sudden change in tone and really unsatisfying finish leave a sour taste in the mouth that's difficult to shake. What did you think of the finale? Did you enjoy the twist? Or are you in the hated camp? Do let us know in the comments.